Hey, how's it going? You got a minute to talk?
Rachel, thank you for taking time out of your day to come and join me and have what I feel is a very important and semi taboo topic. I think, at least for one side of the equation, I'll say specifically the married couples, it's not something they really want to talk about. But I'm excited to talk about how singles and married couples can interact and edify one another in the church. But Rachel, I want to give you just a little bit of time to introduce yourself and talk about where you fit in the internet world.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on. So my name's Rachel and I run Coffee with Rach online, which I've run since 2017. So however long that is. And I like to talk on topics like singleness, sexual sin, modesty, um, guy and girl friendships, kind of really anything having to do with male and females within the body. I think
And
that's kind of how I've chalked it up to be. So,
also, you put out written materials, so you have a couple of ebooks out there. Is that correct?
yes. So, started out as blogging and then turned into more like ebooks. Would love to publish an actual book one day. So,
And you are about to finish seminary. And
yes.
what is the like proper title of the degree that you're getting?
So, I'm getting my master's in theological studies.
All right, great.
So,
And then also you, I think this is funny. You have another page, Rach Goes 90, correct?
yes.
Which is like your thrifting page, if you will. At this point, which of the two is more controversial?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think overall, coffee with rates, but people do not like resellers. Because and I started that back before resellers were really a thing. So, but I don't care. I mean, anyways, yeah, that's a whole other conversation.
My first experience with your page, I guess there was a post going viral and you had shared it to the Coffee with Rach page. And I go to look at the comments of this reel and it's like borderline death threats of like,
Yeah.
you, how dare you do this? And how, like, I'm like, whoa, I thought the theology page was going to be the one to get this response, but the thrifting page seems to be pretty hostile.
Whoa.
So you're studying to get a master's, you've published ebooks, you're an entrepreneur. I mean, you're kind of a well-rounded figure. And then on top of that, you're running a page of over 50,000 at this point.
Well, it fluctuates. Yeah.
Always, yeah. So you've got a lot going on, but right now your niche, like you said, it's kind of this male and female interactions in the body, but you have a very high emphasis on writing or speaking to the Christian single.
Mhm.
Was that always the kind of intended audience that you wanted to reach, or did it happen naturally? Kind of what was the progression of starting the page to where you are now?
So I think my page has always just been, I think what got the most traction and what I've kind of realized my niche to be is whatever is just most transparent with like my life and my passions naturally. And so my page blew up, I think over 30,000 followers within 2020 because I started talking about specifically sexual sin within women and then singleness I think was sprinkled in there too. So that's really where I started, and my first ebook was on sexual sin, and I think it really grew a lot of traction to like the female audience. And I think as I've gotten older and continued to be single, I think naturally like I've seen a more like need an emphasis to talk about that because of just things that I'm learning. And I think people, specifically women, appreciate like following and knowing that they're not alone in certain things that they're going through with singleness. And naturally, I think like sexual sin overlaps into that, or it can. And so those are both really big topics that I really am passionate about because I see that they're also pretty like intertwined, and can be problematic between like the male and female interactions. So yeah, but mostly singleness.
Okay. And then just out of curiosity, the seminary degree, did that kind of start in tandem with the page, or did you have the page running and then you decide, hey, I want to pursue a master's to kind of invest back into what I'm pursuing here? Kind of what was the timeline there?
I think it was around 2020 that I like my page like grew and I was like, oh, I would love to be a writer. So naturally it wasn't even like a second option to be like, oh, I need some type of credential. Not even just for credential purposes, but like for my own well-being so that I'm not, you know, speaking heresy or anything like that. Yeah.
Okay, so have the page. You said you started in 2017.
Mhm.
So you're 3 years in, and 2020 is kind of like when the page grows by what you said, like 30,000 people. You decide, okay, I want to, I guess, kind of do this seriously and see how far I can take it ultimately to writing a book. Enter seminary, you're about to graduate, and you've got this large following of, I don't want to say they're all singles, but whoever they are, they're drawn to this topic of singleness in the church, which I think, if anything, it speaks to how that resonates with people. 50,000 people don't just show up to to listen to stuff
Yeah.
they don't care about. So obviously, this is resonating with an audience, and that's what's so interesting to me is because it shows that there's a need in the church to address this. So I feel corny saying this, but like I've got single friends, so like I relate to this somehow. But really, it is something that I've had to think through. Of okay, it's easy for married couples to mesh. There's a lot of common ground there, but if you look at what the scripture teaches about the church, it's not those lower level things that unify us. So if we're kind of basing our relationships off of shallow, if you will, things like our marital status, and then we're kind of cutting ourselves off from a, I'd say, a large portion of the body, we're not really promoting unity at that point. So I wanted to bring you on, and we can start general, and I'm sure there will be more questions that pop up, but I want to know your first response answer to the question, how should married couples be interacting with singles in the church?
Man, it's such a broad question too, because yeah, it's just there's so many different nuances to it. But I actually just did a post the other day and it got like quite a bit of pushback, which I expected because I think naturally we're like, well, why are we trying to like cater to single people? And it's like, well, we should try and cater to one another so that we can love one another well, whether you're married, single. But I mean, even like, I think it's intentional to take note of like the scriptures and like how they're organized because there are specific people who are mentioned and like Paul specifically does make a difference and like people who are like me, people who are married, like he even talks about widowed people. So it's like there's different forms of and like ways to love people and it's not that like it's completely different. The way that, you know, you may love a single friend might actually be very similar to how you love a married friend as well. But I do think that the way that you go about it and like the intentionality might look a little different and it might either be easier or harder depending on everyone's life involved.
Let me ask you this. Let's start with a specific. Maybe let's start with a bad example, but a common example. When married couples look at singles who are mid to late 20s and they say, ooh, there's a problem here. Let's start with that. How do singles, I guess, initially feel or respond to the view that, oh, you are single at this age, content and single at this age, but there's still a problem. So how does a single respond to that? And how should a married couple maybe change their mindset?
So, depending on the relationship, of course, but I whenever people say that to me, and they're usually pretty like sad about that because no one wants to be like, because usually that person probably wants to be married. So then like people are like, well, what's wrong with you? And it's like, I don't know. Maybe there's something is wrong. Like something is wrong with me. I don't know. But scripture would hopefully like comfort that person and remind them of the truth. But so whenever that happens, I always like to encourage people like, hey, this is actually not a reflection of you. And I mean, to be honest, like there are certain things that you are single for maybe a reason, and like there is certain tangible things. So I never want to be like, well, nothing's wrong with you. But there also is a lot of truth to like that actually might just be a heart issue in the married person's like heart and like how they've been conditioned to believe about singleness in marriage. Because it's fascinating to think about like the prosperity gospel mixed in with like purity culture and like singleness, because we've kind of been taught in like typical Western evangelical worlds that like if you're good enough, you're gonna be able to get married and you're gonna have a good life. And so I think just really debunking those truths and like or those lies and like reminding yourself of what scripture says. And so then for the single to be able to communicate that to the married person if there is that relationship there, and being like, hey, like I always like to go at it with like questioning of like, hey, why do you think that, or what made you think that, or like where do you think that comes from, or whatever. So that it's more of like a conversation, and then being able to be like, well, this is actually how like I see it. Um, yeah, and then also I think at that point, like teaching and like educating on like the beauty of singleness, whether it is for the rest of my life or like other singles' lives, or just in like this time, because Paul does talk about the differences in First Corinthians. Like there obviously is a difference, but it doesn't mean that it's one is greater than the other.
Yeah, and there are certainly some advantages to singleness that I think married couples tend to forget about is that for a single person to maybe pack their bags and go across the world to go maybe pursue a more dangerous or a more I don't want to say reckless, but dangerous. Let's say dangerous, a more dangerous pursuit. That's far easier for somebody who's not maybe responsible for a family, responsible for another person. So, and that's kind of as I think through this, I've been thinking about advantages are something that ought to be invested into. And certainly there are also advantages to being married, and those advantages ought to be invested into. So a married couple looks at somebody who's single, they say, well, what's the problem here? And maybe that conversation happens, oh, there's not really a problem. These are actually good things that I have in my life. And they say, oh, okay, yeah, but they're still single. So like we should fix that. And I see another category of like they see it as a fundamental problem, but then married couples will make it like their goal to then find a partner for the single. So give me kind of your perspective on maybe this church matchmaking, I guess, scenario, this practice of married couples taking it upon themselves to see it's my spiritual responsibility within the church to find a spouse for this person. is that as helpful as couples tend to think it is?
I think that the most appropriate thing to do is, for one, I feel like okay, there's two different sides of the coin. One, if some of my friends who are married, who I trust and I know that their character, and they come to me and say, "Hey, I know someone. Would that make you feel uncomfortable, or would you be interested in that?" Um, and so it's like giving them the option, or there's like the other side of the coin that like one of my friends who's also a older single in the church, she's not even 30 yet, but that is considered like older. Um, she was like her second time at the church, and some mom who had like I think 4 or 5 kids just came up to her and was like, "Oh, do you know like so and so? I want to get you like matched up with them." I'm like, and then time would tell us that she didn't even know who she was. First off, she doesn't know her integrity, her character, and then the guy that she was trying to set her up with is a no go. So it's like trying to fix a problem that actually isn't going to be fixed, only create more problems, is not helpful. So I think that there's like, if you have buy-in with someone, you should ask for their permission, be like, "Hey, is this something you would want?" Because like for me personally, I don't take it offensively when people are like, "Hey, I know someone who would be great for you." I'm like, "Cool." But like also if some random person were to like say something like that to me, I'm like, "Why are you maybe assuming that I'm like just desperately looking for anyone who is single?" So I think that there's just like it's kind of like not it's kind of like rebuking someone almost, or like correcting someone. Like you have to have that buy-in with them and like that trust of like, "Oh, I know your character. I know this other person's character." And I think it'd be beneficial rather than just trying to like put two and two together that actually wouldn't work,
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
I agree, and I don't want to say I'm biased. This is just how it worked out for my wife and I. We were introduced by a third party, somebody who knew our families well, knew us, and thought we'd be a good fit. So I guess by personal experience, I'll always be a little bit sympathetic to it can work. I at least know of one situation where it did,
Yeah.
but I think the danger is when it becomes flippant. And in an earlier episode, I was talking with Steve Can Draw. We were talking about advice and bad advice we've been given. And you almost have to approach that of like, you make this connection and you have to think, what if they listen to you? And
Mm.
I feel like a lot of people don't think through that point of, oh, I'll just throw out a name. But what if they do listen to you? What if they do end up with them? Heaven forbid, what if they end up married
Mm.
when they never should have been together in the first place?
Yeah.
And I I think there's at least some consideration to be made of before you try to match make somebody. Think of the fullest extent of like where this can go. Should
Yeah.
they be married? Well, why are you why are you even encouraging them to connect if you don't think they should be married in the first place?
Right.
So, okay, maybe not approach the visitor at church and say,
Right.
"Hey,
Yeah.
we've got this boy." Um, how do you feel? I've got opinions on this, but I want to know how you feel about life groups or Sunday school classes, whatever you want to call them, specifically designated as the singles group. Have you had any experience with churches that have a singles group?
So I'm so glad that you asked this because so quick little background. I was at a mega church for multiple years, long time ago. And they were very like all singles, all like different stages of life. Singles there, they even had young moms with kids, young married couples without kids, like, every single niche that you could think of. Um, And so then long story short, I stopped going to local church altogether for about 5, 6 years. And it was around the time of seminary that I was like, oh, I actually need the local body. And so I really went through like a process of relearning why the local body even is important and like biblical. And so I think now with that perspective, I and like my church now, we do all generational community groups. And it between that and then also like my school classes and my church's teachings, like realizing that our like the body was never supposed to be separated by parts. Like if you think about it, if you're like trying to accomplish something, but then you put all the arms in one pile, all the legs in one pile, all the ears, you're not going to have anything coherent. Like you need the body to be the body. And when everything is so separated, you can't see like the harmony and the goodness of like the body working together, as Paul talks about. And so, and I think that there's obviously some validity in like being with like the same age and life stage. I think that there's a beautiful thing in like moms or dads being together and learning from one another, accountability, like whatever it is. But also like the danger in that is if you're only in like that stage of life, you forget that there are people outside of that world. And so, and then it also like talks about, Paul talks about, you know, how many times he brings up the fact of like, oh, younger ones with like their correlation to older ones, and then older ones to, you know, whether that's in age or in like different spiritual maturity. You need the body to be the body, not just body parts. And I think for my own walk with Christ, having it all generational has been so beautiful. So yeah.
No, I agree. My wife and I, we just started attending a church where it's combined, like as much as it can possibly be, it's combined. And just in the few months that we've been at this church, as opposed to a background where it's trying to see how many different subgroups we can make and then subgroups of that subgroup, it's so refreshing to be with much older saints and people that are in our stage of life. It's such a beautiful thing. And I have a bone to pick with like single groups because it does feel like it's kind of like a corner that we put singles in and say, again, back to the idea of it being a problem. Hey, get the problem fixed. And then when you're married, you can get out. It's like a
Right.
cage almost of like, we're going to put them all together. Surely the odds are in our favor that some of them will get married.
Yeah.
Then when they're married, we'll pull them out and then we'll use them in the church. And I just think that's messed up because like we were saying before, there is that advantage to being single and advantages are to be invested in. Um, so let me ask you this. A married couple, older couple sees you. Would you rather them I'll build on this even. Older couple, they've been in business, the business world for 40 years, they have experience, and they come across you. Would it be more beneficial to you for them to try to solve your singleness or to teach you business practices for your thrifting?
Definitely business. Yeah.
And that's what I would think. And I feel like when we have the mindset of we need to solve their singleness somehow, well, there's so much more to a person than their relationship status. So I guess piggybacking off of that, there's so much more to know about a person than their relationship status. And that's where I think being together does help. You know, putting everybody in a cage and saying, figure it out. Well, there's no way that we're going to know anything beyond especially if you're going to label the class the singles class. Well, what
Yeah.
does that tell you about those people? All I know about them is that they're single, and beyond that,
Right.
that's all I know. And they've tried to fix it by saying that's our college and career class. Well,
The young
oh,
adults.
the young adults. Okay. And
Yeah.
then you're in the young adults class and you look over and you see somebody who's like in their mid 40s and you're thinking like, hold on a second.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is really the young adults class anymore. So there's way more to people than their relationship status. And you hit on a very important point of the church is a body, not just body parts. And that's huge. That's so important. So what I'm picking up here is married couples can, one, try to have a stronger relationship with a person before they start making, I guess, advice, suggestions. But then two, it would be better for a married couple to invest into the person as a whole rather than just their relationship situation. And there are, Jesus talks about there being kind of eunuchs by their own choice. There are some people who want to be single. And I want to ask you, maybe vague, maybe too vague, just let me know. People like to throw out the gift of singleness, but I feel like it's become such a misunderstood term because it's used flippantly. Some people see just being single as, well, the only way I can cope with this is I must have the gift of singleness. And then there are some people who genuinely feel that they have this calling upon their life to be single and I would say, a supernatural contentment with it. So how do you view the gift of singleness? Is it as common as people make it out to be? What are your thoughts on that?
Hmm. I think so. For one, I not necessarily pushing back, but I think that there definitely is like an aspect of like super. I think some people have a supernatural gift of being content, but I also know of like even brothers and sisters who are like same sex attracted that choose to be single out of devotion to the Lord. They still struggle with like the desire to want to be with someone, but their desire to be obedient to Christ trumps that. And so I would say that it's a choice to be faithful to the Lord with your singleness. And that's assuming if God does not bring someone or it never opens up that door. So I think it's a bit hard, but I do think that like we've kind of tried to make the gift of singleness this like mystical thing when really like maybe the Lord just really has not opened up that door and he might do that when you are 60 or 70. And I think a lot of the times, I don't mean to laugh, but I see these like young 18-year-olds who are like, "Oh, God's given me the gift of singleness." I'm like, "Sarah, you are 18. Like, relax." And I don't mean to be insensitive because those things are real. But I do think that we've thrown around like the gift, like the words gift of singleness so much that it almost like people don't believe it. But I think it's because we haven't taught about the pros of singleness. And like Paul talks about like literally what married people are concerned with worldly matters, not in a bad worldly matters, like taking care of your family. Those are good and God glorifying things. But the truth is, like, your attention is taken away from the Lord. And so it's like for the single person, you get to fully focus and have your affections fully set on Christ and serving Christ, which is what Paul and Jesus both did. And so it's like, obviously, it is not a sinful matter to be single because the only sinless one was single. But then it goes back to like Paul trying to convince people because the early church was like, oh, well, singleness is the only holy, route because, you know, all these things. and it's a waste of time to be married and da da da. And so then like Paul is sitting there trying to convince people, hey, marriage is actually also good. And so anyways, I feel like I just get on these rampages, but I do think that like we really need to like look at what the gift of singleness means in context of like what the scriptures say regarding even what our purpose is as believers, and like the Great Commission in itself, not this mystical, well, obviously like there's more for me because I don't know.
No, I think I like that you touch on, Jesus living a single life, and yet he is the standard of perfection and holiness for all of us. And I would go a step further and say that Jesus being single, alone, his entire life, his earthly life, he even is able to be a symbol of us, of like, to be completely fulfilled as a person does not require any type of sexual expression, which I think a lot of people begin to get this identity crisis of like, I am not fully human, I'm not fully complete as a person unless I have this fulfillment of, the coming together with another person, the two becoming one. And there is some encouragement there, I hope, for the single, of like, you can be completely you to the fullest extent without any expression in that way, and Jesus is the prime example of that. Now, that's not to say, like you're getting at, of like early church, the early church teachers, like for a minute, were very big on like asceticism and like just basically monastic, like live a monastic life, be a monk. And I can't remember which church father it was. I'm not even going to guess because I'll probably get it wrong, but like parents were trying to keep their daughters from listening to this church father because sitting under their teaching resulted in the daughters being like, I don't want to be married, I want to be single. So there's also this, the pendulum, there's always a pendulum that can swing too far each
Right.
way. But 100% you can be completely fulfilled as a person and be single, but also that is to not demonize the other route. And we had a conversation about, it was on one of my posts about, demonizing isn't the solution to idolizing, which I want to bring that up. You Let's talk about the idolizing of marriage. That's a theme that comes up in your post quite often. So, what's your take on that? Where do you think it stems from? What is the solution? If singleness is not the solution to it, what is the solution to this idolizing of marriage?
It's a great question. I think being content in whatever season the Lord has you in. And I hate how like corny these like phrases have become, because it really is like the truth of like, even if we were to get married, who's to say that our spouse won't pass away or get sick? Like it's there's no promises. And like even having a spouse, like it will not make you feel fulfilled. There's so many married couples that I talk to and they struggle with loneliness. Like there's so many things. And so I think like the idolization comes from living in a culture that heavily prioritizes it. And like we see, yeah, like even I love that you mentioned like the sexual identity. Like our culture has really dumbed our humanness down to sexual beings, which we are, but that is not just who we are. Like that is part of who we are, but it is not like who we are as humans. And so I think that coming back to what is our purpose is like crucial and foundational to the idolization issue, but also like contentment as well. And it's so hard because I think within purity culture, it's like if you said that you desired marriage, I think this is beyond purity culture, but like if you were like, oh well, I really desire to be married, but that would then mean that you don't have enough faith in the Lord. So then now we've swung to the other side of the pendulum of, well, I have desires and I want to be married, and that is not a bad thing. Well, what happens when that desire actually hinders you from following Christ? And like what happens when like those desires actually become coveting and sin? Where's like the line? How do you draw the line? Because desires aren't wrong. Like it's not bad at all, you know? But at the same time, like I think that we are so emotion led that like anytime someone says something about like emotions being bad in the slightest, we don't like that. And so that's why whenever on every single post that I do about like idolization of single or of marriage, I always have to say something along the lines of desires are not bad, but because that nuance does need to be there too. But yeah, it's I don't know, but it's a very tricky thing because I think a lot of it is just internal heart desires and affections and figuring out where the line is of desires are good and fine, but then also like where is your final like where is your hope being placed? Yeah.
No, absolutely. So almost like your desires, kind of like an umbrella. Like ultimately, all of your desires come into subjection under one person, and that is Christ. And any desire that may deviate from underneath the umbrella, that's where we need to be concerning. And I get it. I get it. And there are some people who, in their pursuit of marriage, may even end up in disobedience to Christ. I think it's a shame for maybe a young man or a young woman to kind of be at this crossroads of I'm engaged. I'll say this as a side note. I love a good breakup. Usually when people break up, it sometimes, I won't even say sometimes, majority of the time, something huge is happening. Then there are the petty things. But like I love a good breakup. And like the further it is into the relationship, I love it even more of like I
Yeah.
like a good engagement being called off.
Yeah.
And because there's so much at stake, and I hate the thought of a young man or a young woman maybe being on their way to doing mighty things in the kingdom of God. A young man who may be a phenomenal pastor, but decides, hey, this is the girl I've got, marries her, and then he's an accountant 30 years down the road because maybe his wife was more concerned about their paycheck than what he felt called to do. So there is something to, I'll say this, and not to be mystic about it, but obedience is priority. Always. Obedience is priority, and obedience is how we show our affections. If you love Christ, you will obey him. So when it comes down to it, if the person you're with is at odds with your obedience to Christ, the person's got to go. Always. So I love a good breakup. I I love to see it. So and breakup. Let's talk about breakups for a minute. I've I've had my heart broken plenty of times, and I was a part of, I guess, dating culture early on, like early 20s, and it's dumb. First of all, it's a really just terrible place to be. But I always walked away from a ended relationship thinking, ugh, I am now less human. So what would be, because we have this idea of like, if I was good, like if I was not broken, then the relationship would have worked and we would have been married and whatever. What would be your comfort to the Christian who's gone through a breakup and they're feeling subpar because good Christians have lasting relationships?
Mm. I think knowing that like if the relationship was supposed to work out, it would have worked out. And like I think I tend to the side of like really leaning so much on the sovereignty of God of like, well, if it was going to work out, it would have worked out, like completely just forgetting free will. But um I think I mean that, but also like it's hard because so I've actually never, which is really ironic, and I don't really like sharing about it because people are like, meh, meh, meh. I've actually never been in a relationship. I've liked one guy before, and that was, long story short, a like kind of situationship, which I know that when I started posting about it, you're like, what is that? Um, that was like a like almost 2 year long situation that was very annoying and confusing and hurtful. But so I don't really know if I have much to say about breakups, but I will say there's been multiple guys within the last few years that we've started talking, and I see some things that I'm like, I'm not the biggest fan of, but whatever. But in like my heart of hearts, I know it's just not it. And not that he's a bad guy, not that I'm great and he's bad or anything like that. I just know that it's not it. And I know that if I were to be with him, I would be distracted and my race would be hindered. And so I think really whether it's ending things that wasn't actually a real relationship or ending a situationship or ending a talking stage or whatever, I think just coming back to the realization of what is my purpose and who is going to be a partner who like I can do the race well with, not being hindered or slowed down. Um, and I think also like if you do end up being like broken up with by someone who you did think that that would be like who you would be able to run the race well with. I think just coming back to like the gospel truths of how much Christ loves you and knowing that like that's all that matters at like the end of the day, which sounds corny again, but it really is like that needs to be enough for us.
Absolutely. And you earlier in the conversation, you touched on like, although singleness may be a gift and there may be like a contentment that comes with it, there are still struggles. And totally agree. And I will not be one who's like, because I agree with you that you can rest mightily in the fact that no person can thwart the plans of God. So if it didn't work out, it happened because God has ordained it, allowed it to take place. But that also doesn't negate the fact that it's tough. I think an example of whenever the Israelites crossed the Jordan into the promised land, they still fought so many more battles.
Yeah.
And so in the Christian life, there are still battles to be fought in the promised land, if you will. So you're absolutely right. And we seem to overcomplicate it by not going to Christ and what is it? Needlessly, we carry these burdens because we just don't go to Christ, and we forget that the one person who can sympathize with us 100% is Christ. He is labeled like a co-sufferer, somebody who can sympathize with us and understand exactly how we're feeling. So absolutely. I think that that is the really the ultimate answer to it. You're broken up with, you feel like, oh, I thought this was going to work. It didn't work. Well, sure, you can rest in the sovereignty of God and maybe at a, like a factual level say, okay, it God did not want it to happen. But also on the emotional level, I think there is, I agree, hope to be found in the fact that there's Jesus, and that is enough. And I'll add to it, that's probably the better lesson to learn first before you're ever in a relationship in the first place, is Jesus is enough, because there will be hardships in a relationship, in a marriage, where you cannot lean on your spouse to solve the problem. You have to rest in, you and your spouse have to rest in the fact that Jesus is enough. So learn that early on. And I think you're absolutely correct. Uh, Speaking of moving from breakups to actual dating, if I may, what would be your diagnosis of the condition, I guess, of the Christian dating pool right now? How are things looking?
Not good. Not good. Um, yeah, I mean, you have all okay. Gosh, it's so non-committal. There's no commitment, there's no pursuit, honestly, on like either side. So it's like the guy isn't pursuing the girl, and I'm not necessarily against girls pursuing the guy and shooting her shot, but there's no pursuit. It's just passive. The guys are being passive, the girls are being passive. And so nothing, so then that's where like the situationships stem from, is because both people don't want to get hurt. And so then both give like half and half. So then it's like, well, maybe he's into me, maybe she's into me. And then like there's no full pursuit. And that's why we have these situationships. That's why we have all this confusion, and both on both girl and guy side. Um, and that's just so hard. That's so hard.
For people like me, I know now, but people like me who don't know what a situationship is, could you briefly give your definition of what a situationship is?
Okay, so trying to be short with it. Basically it's a guy and girl find themselves into a situation where I think they like I think I like him, maybe, or I think he likes me, but I'm not sure. But we talk all the time. We hang out. Oh, I think we actually went on a date. Maybe it wasn't a date. Maybe it was just hanging out. Maybe we're just friends. But we do talk all the time. And so I get like mixed like feelings from him. And no one actually says anything. Like it's the passivity. And so you spend all this time not actually like dating or talking, but like wondering if what it is something. And usually it's between friends. And especially I think it like flourishes in the Christian world, because you have these nice Christian guys who just want to be good brothers, and then it turns into flirtiness. And then you have the girls who are just eating it up, and then can also be manipulative back, as both genders can be. And so it's the passivity thing. It's basically like dating, but on the most extreme passive level.
Hmm. Which is so bizarre to me. You're talking about this issue of being passive. If let's look at Paul's teaching for husbands, that they are to love as Christ loves the church. Well, if you look at how Christ's love for people is described, it's a very active love. It is one that prompts action. So I'll say a word to the guys, if I may. You are going to have to be active at some point, because to love as Christ loves demands it. So I can see from the foundation, if if people are trying to be passive and expect something to happen, I don't think we could in good conscience call that love. But based off of the dominance of situationships, do you think people do want love? Do you think maybe the ultimate problem is that people aren't looking for a long-term thing, or do they want the long-term thing and they just don't know how to get there properly?
Mm, I think I could probably make a case for both. Because as you were talking, I think looking at it through the lens of like Christ and his bride, well, how's the condition of like his bride right now? Especially in the Western world, we are so individualistic. So we don't actually serve. There's so many churchgoers, there's so many Christians who do not serve one another. There is no action. And so it's like that's obviously going to play a part into their love life. Like they don't see the point of love. They can like one of my favorite things is like phrases and questions that I like to ask myself is do I want a husband or do I just want the benefits of a husband? And I think that like our condition right now is like we want the benefits without the actual commitment. And just like we do with Christ, like we want the benefits and the gifts of Christ without actually wanting to lay our lives down for him. And so like and that's, no new thing because we see that in scripture like we always worship the creation over the creator. Like that's it's such a human problem and so it's easy to like get discouraged with like how it is right now, but like this is no new thing. It just manifests itself differently.
Yep.
So that's what I would say. We want the benefits, not the actual like commitment.
I was listening to something recently and they were talking about what happens when you have 100 different cereals to choose from, and it promotes this consumerism ideology, and that has 100% infiltrated the church. Of the average churchgoer is used to showing up, sitting in their seat, getting what they paid for, if you will, and leaving without ever having to tell somebody their name.
Right.
And you're 100% correct that if that's how we're operating in the church, and unfortunately culture is shaping the church when it should be the opposite. But when you have a culture that is driven by individualism and consumerism, then that gets into the church is then going to affect the people. And so it makes sense why, if the church is individualistic and consumer driven, our relationships are going to be individualistic and consumer driven.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're spot on. It's about the benefits without the actual commitment. And I would say, going back to Christ being the ideal lover, if you will, not only was his love proactive, but it was also sacrificial. So if you're not willing to actually do something that costs you something, you're probably not ready for that relationship either. In for some, that cost may be as simple as just mustering up the courage, getting over maybe an anxiety that you have and saying, it's scary, but I'm going to go talk to them.
Mm-hmm.
Down the road, that may look like, this is a scary thing, but I'm going to obey, and we're going to move across the country or whatever. But love is sacrificial. So if you're not willing to give and you're not willing to act outside of yourself, makes sense why we're stuck in this relationship limbo.
Mm-hmm.
That's fascinating. So there's so much to unpack there. So you would say right now, across the board, the biggest problem as far as relationships in the church is the growth and the dominance of situationships. That, would you say that is the top priority problem that we should probably address as the church with relationships? Or would you say there's maybe something deeper?
Mm. I think that's man, it's hard to categorize, but I think that's one of the big ones. And I think if we look at how men are within the church and the local body, that will often tell us how they're going to like how the like relationship world is going to be. Because even like, look at, I don't know, the ongoing joke of the chair stacking boys. We don't even see them doing that. They leave. They don't want to serve. They don't want to stack the chairs. Like, and that's, I think, maybe a generalization, but I think by and large, the guys are not wanting to like even show off anymore because they will just like send a Snapchat or send a DM when they get home. And women or girls, both and or, but we just learn to settle for less and less, unfortunately, because the bar is so low. And so it's a shame. So I don't know if that actually answers your question, but I do think that the local church and looking at the local church is really telling.
Yeah. No, that 100%. It kind of going off of that, I would argue you're talking kind of this two-sided problem. Guys don't want to impress, and girls are kind of just taking it and saying, okay, we'll just lower the bar. The untapped strength of women is that if they maintain the high bar, they can turn a barbarian into a prince. And that's just, that is the beautiful dynamic of, if women expect men to conform and to get their act together, they will.
Yeah.
That is why Western civilization has prevailed, is because men have had something to fight for and they've had to earn something. And I would agree, it's going to be a problem. It's already a problem of, men have nothing to strive for. Or I don't know if the chicken or the egg came first. I don't know what broke, but now we're at a point where men don't strive because they have no bar to strive for. And either somebody has got to raise the bar. I agree. So fascinating stuff. I feel like I may have to have you come back on, and there's a lot more to unpack, but I feel like I'll leave it there for this go. So much. This is such a good conversation. I'm so thankful that you came on. What can we expect next from you? Graduating seminary soon, so obviously a big life change, but what's on the horizon for Coffee with Rach?
I feel like you know as much as me. I'm not sure. I graduate in May. I just started, so I've been thinking about doing some PhD work. Would love to do that and kind of narrow down my quote unquote expertise on something. And so I'm kind of praying and thinking into that. Would love to continue writing, and I've kind of taken like a 2-year break of writing. So would love to, I think, just create more discipline for that. But we'll find out. We'll see what God's gonna do. Excited to kind of, I think, even narrow down my niche, like specific, like be more specific in things, and so learn more about that. Yeah, that's kind of where I'm headed.
Awesome. So everyone can find you at Coffee with Rach on Instagram. Also, Rach goes 90s, plural?
Singular.
Rach goes 90.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Rach goes 90 on Instagram. What is your website? Like, where can everybody find your books, your resources in that way?
It's just coffeewithrach.com.
All right. Simple enough. Yeah. So at Coffee with Rach on Instagram, and that is your website. And then Rach goes 90 for all of your thrifting and controversial content. Rachael, thank you so much for coming on the show. We'll have to do this again. I think there's a lot more to unpack, but until then, I'll talk to you later.
Bye.